So, psychedelic synesthesia. So synesthesia is a condition which occurs naturally in a small percentage of the population, somewhere between 1% and 3% of the population, depending on how you measure it and survey it, have synesthesia. And I'll explain what it is. There is so a sensory experience induces another concurrent sensory experience. So for instance, the most common one with congenital synesthesia is grapheme colour synesthesia. So if you see letters or numbers, they may be associated with certain colours. Now that's synesthesia, because, I'll come to it in a minute, because it is automatic, it happens automatically, they can't turn it on or off, it just happens. It has specificity, so each colour, each letter or number have a specific colour, and it's the same every time. That means it has consistency, and it's also accessible to consciousness. Now, they may not kind of ordinarily think about it, but if you stop and ask them and go, oh yeah, B is blue or whatever. So it has accessibility to consciousness. So they're the four criteria of congenital synesthesia. So congenital synesthesia means people have it from birth, although it doesn't really manifest obviously until people start talking as young children, but it's also thought to be somewhat developmental as well. So that although it's congenital and there's some degree of genetic inheritance, it would seem, there's some developmental influences as well. So children may learn kind of colours associated with certain letters of the alphabet, perhaps they had on fridge magnets, but then it stays throughout life. So that's congenital synesthesia. Psychedelic synesthesia is the kind of induced version, which is kind of temporary, typically, although I'm going to talk more about that, and obviously under the influence of chemical agents such as LSD. We've known about induced psychedelic synesthesia ever since Havelock Ellis took mescaline, and actually there were some accounts earlier in the literature from Le Club de Hachins, I can't say that, with use of hashish as well. But Albert Hoffman, on his very first LSD trip, if you've ever read LSD, My Problem Child, he talks about having synesthesia on the first ever acid trip. What's going on here with my slides? There you go. And he said this: kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in coloured fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in constant flux. So that's the kind of geometric patterns, the entoptics. But then he said it was particularly remarkable how every acoustic perception, such as the sound of a door handle or a passing automobile, became transformed into optical perceptions. Every sound generated a vividly changing image with its own consistent form and colour. So he had synesthesia, essentially. He also then had an out-of-body experience and thought he was having a near-death experience, and, well, we all know the story. And we find incidences of psychedelically induced synesthesia all over the world where it's being used, such as with the Shipibo, perhaps, with the use of ayahuasca. It's said, and I don't know how apocryphal this is, but, you know, under the influence of ayahuasca, people see these geometric patterns, these entoptics, and they move with the sound for some people as well. So you have this kind of dynamic synesthetic experience of seeing sound. And well, it's said that the Shipibo use these for healing, and they kind of get very fascinated by them, and they kind of paint them on everything, basically on the faces of people, on their artwork. They make yarn work out of them. So that possibly, we'll speculate here, is what a song looks like, and what an ayahuasca song looks like, an Icaro. For somebody anyway, perhaps. We also got some other classic cases as well. The Grateful Dead just played their 50th anniversary gig in the States, and I suppose anyone was there. And they were quite a famous band, you know, the start of psychedelic rock. They had a very famous sound engineer, a guy called I've forgotten his name. Somebody help me. Owsley, thank you very much. So good, Luke. Where were you when I need you? Owsley, who was also an underground LSD chemist, and he was a sound engineer, and he put his two interests together, and he would take lots of LSD when he was doing the sound checks, And one time he was doing the sound check for the band, and he saw the music coming out of the speakers in waves. And so he rearranged all the levels and even rearranged the position of the speakers and whatnot, so that you got the best visual effect from the sound. It's very cool. They probably still sounded terrible. I'm not a Grateful Dead fan, sorry about that. But at least it looked good. Okay. And this is where we get the birth of, the integration between light and sound in, psychedelic music really kind of brought that whole, that kind of phantasm to life, this kind of mixing sound with music. So you're kind of getting a synthetic synesthesia experience in a way, which could be enhanced perhaps under the influence of psychedelics. Anyway, just to prove I'm actually a scientist, I did some research on this with a colleague at Oxford, Devon Terhune, and we realised we scoured the literature, and there was, although everybody talks about, psychedelics induced synesthesia, no one had done any real research on it. There was a couple of kind of fairly poorly controlled experiments in the kind of 60s, and everyone mentions it, but nobody talks about the actual research because there isn't much. There's a massive lacuna, even though we've known about this experience for over 100 years. So we thought, let's do a survey, okay? So this is where it gets a bit shonky. I don't remember what I'm doing. Okay, so there are some lab studies. The phenomena has a bearing. I'll miss all that bit out. Let's just jump to the survey, shall we? Okay, so we conducted an online survey using a Qualtrics system. It's a rather ambitious and massive survey. So we had lots of questions about the kind of people's drug use, their frequency of use, whether or not induced synesthesia or not, and the different types of synesthesia, and what different drugs, whether different drugs induced synesthesia as well. So we asked for the types of drugs that had induced it and what kinds of synesthesia it had induced. And it ended up with something like nearly 800 questions, okay, this survey. But there was lots of skip logic in there, so if you hadn't taken those drugs, you wouldn't answer that question. If you'd taken those drugs and had synesthesia, then you would kind of go on to describe it. But it was this massive database. We had about 500,000 data points, which we're still kind of crunching through some extra analyses. And there was a basic list of 27 possible inducers of synesthesia, which is taken from the literature of congenital synesthesia, and obviously the same, but as concurrents. So whether or not perhaps graphemes induce colour, or there were some good ones like orgasms producing kind of lights or something like that, visual phenomena, which is actually synesthesia, apparently. So there you go. And we had a massive survey with the help of Erowid. We put it online, and we got something like 16,000 respondents. Because it was so big survey, not everybody completed it, and we just took everyone who completed it. There's about 647 people, mostly from the States, about a quarter from the UK, and from elsewhere. I'll get to the results. So what we tried to do is a taxonomy of the kinds of experiences that people have. But first of all, we looked at the prevalence, okay? So what is the prevalence of people reporting synesthesia having taken a particular substance? And we tried to just categorize those somewhat loosely by the type of psychedelic, or the type of drug in this case. And so at the top you see your kind of classic tryptamines are very good. They have a high prevalence of inducing synesthesia experiences, self-reported. LSD, ayahuasca, psilocybin, typically somewhere between 45 and 58% of people taking any of those will have an experience of synesthesia. I've never had one, they're quite lucky. Salvia is a bit of an odd one out, because salvia isn't serotonergic, it isn't like the tryptamines, but it also is kind of quite prevalent in inducing these kinds of experiences. Then next we have the phenethylamines, then the dissociatives, and then it goes somewhat more random down towards the bottom. Typically people don't report having these experiences induced through alcohol or nicotine, as you might expect, although a few did. I would like to know what they're drinking. Curiously as well, we actually thought it struck me this looks a little bit like the scale of harms thing, the correlation they did. So we had a look at that, and it actually does have a nice correlation with the scale of harm. So it seems like the more dangerous drugs are less likely to induce synesthesia. And it could be like a kind of index of weirdness, perhaps. Drugs are certainly weird, they tend to be somewhat more safe, which is quite interesting, I think. That's a whole other paper. And then we did some more statistics. We basically found that LSD and psilocybin were kind of significant in inducing synesthesia compared to the other ones. Most interestingly, we also asked people who had congenital synesthesia. So these are people who we're looking at just people who tried psychedelics but don't have synesthesia. And then we also asked people who had congenital synesthesia of whether they'd taken any drugs and what kind of experiences they had. And we said, so is your normal synesthesia either enhanced or reduced by taking this particular drug? And we found a really nice correlation between that and the prevalence of experiences with people who don't have synesthesia. So just to put that in a different way, the same drugs that induce synesthesia in people who don't have it are also the ones that enhance synesthesia in those that do. And that's quite interesting because it tells us that there may be some kind of relationship here between congenital synesthesia and psychedelically induced synesthesia, i.e. what's happening neurobiologically. Not everybody in the synesthesia research field likes that because they all have their pet theories, and they like to think that kind of psychedelically induced synesthesia isn't the same as congenital synesthesia. But, well, it isn't the same, and I'll come back to that. We also looked at the kinds of experiences that people had. So the types, typically it was sound, colour. So people would see sounds, maybe colourful, as colours, often as shapes as well. Typically they're kind of geometric entoptic patterns. They're usually dynamic and they change with the sounds. Sound space, sound touch, colour taste, etc., etc. Now these are fairly typical to congenital synesthesia as well, although grapheme colour, the one right at the bottom, is the one most typical to congenital synesthesia. Now we don't see that very much with psychedelic synesthesia. However, there's a few points here. First of all, people, when they are under the influence of psychedelics, aren't usually reading things necessarily, so they may not get, perhaps in a festival or in the forest or in psychotherapy or whatever, they may not be reading much literature to induce that experience. And secondly, grapheme colour synesthesia has some kind of developmental origins as well. So if it's a kind of very brief, temporary experience, you might not necessarily have colours associated with particular letters or numbers. Why would we think that would happen? At the same time, people do tend to listen to music when they're on psychedelics quite often, I've heard, and so you might get a a higher prevalence of people having sound colour and sound shape. Typically though, and this is where our taxonomy fell apart, we thought, wouldn't it be great if salvia induced, kind of taste, colour, and LSD induced another type. It didn't really work like that. There was just kind of generic sense. There wasn't really any differences across different classes of drugs. So no one drug induces one particular type of synesthesia, but there's a kind of generically. Maybe there is if we had a bigger database, but not with this. To give you a sense of some of the kind of qualitative reports people gave as well. So we asked people to just say, well, describe the kind of experiences as well. So this is a massive, we've got a lot of responses, and this is a kind of fairly typical one from somebody on LSD. So I said, I doubted it more at first, then less. Possibly improvised music, which developed the texture of a falling strand of honey, which responded with drop globs, I think that's a made-up word, of width corresponding to the tonal characteristics, pitch and volume, of each note as it was played. I guess you could file it under seeing music. I guess you could. Here's another one from LSD. This one has a bit more of a practical application, perhaps, on the dance floor. LSD, so bass frequencies rotated my hips or felt like experiencing acceleration. The mid-range was an expansion of my flesh, and higher frequencies were a twinkling that was popping above my head, but I was feeling the twinkling. So that one's much more of a kind of immediately, how would you call that, kind of tactile experience as well. However, unlike congenital synesthesia, which is typically quite specific, a particular colour will induce a particular taste, or a particular letter induces a particular colour, they can be quite complex with psychedelics, and you get responses like this. There's somebody on ayahuasca. What do you do? What do you do? One of the other problems, of course, with this research is asking people to please complete a survey of your synesthetic experiences while on drugs is they assume you mean they have to complete the survey while they're on drugs, and they say, that's the danger of doing internet research, I guess, you know. Okay, so a brief summary, and then I'll quickly talk about a couple of case studies. So we found that the same drugs that induce synesthesia also enhance it. These are primarily serotonergic agonists, although not necessarily. Salvia is also a pretty good synesthesia inducer. So maybe there's some evidence for the serotonin hypothesis put forward by Brang and Ramachandran for synesthesia, congenital synesthesia. Yes, to some extent, but there may be multiple etiologies for synesthesia, and serotonic basis for them may be just one of them. So the types of drugs induced synesthesia are also common to congenital synesthesia, so we can say, yes, there are some similarities, although rarely with a grapheme as an inducer. And there are meaningful patterns in the data. This is not just random responses because of our really tidy correlation we had. There are some limitations, self-report studies, but the results are somewhat indicative and point towards experimental research, we hope. Just to kind of go back to then the criteria for induced sort of congenital synesthesia then. So the first thing is it should be accessible to consciousness. You should be able to experience it consciously, although you may not be paying awareness to it ordinarily because it's automatic. So it has automaticity. It just happens. You don't turn it on or off. It just happens. You know, if you have synesthesia, B is always blue. You know, it has I can't say it. Thank you very much. It has that specificity in that B is blue. Okay, and it's not. B is blue, and sometimes it turns into a small dragon with a train of unicorns behind it, for instance. So it's quite specific, and it also has consistency. So you can test somebody for their behaviorally for their synesthesia, and then you can come back a month, a year, 3 years later, and test them again, and they'll have the same responses. With psychedelic synesthesia, we don't necessarily have these things. We have accessibility to consciousness, so people are definitely experiencing these. They go, yeah, I saw the sounds coming out of the speakers. They're not necessarily that specific, though. They can be highly complex. Sometimes people have one inducer and maybe several concurrent sensory experiences. So you not only kind of see the sound, but you can taste it, and you become it, and you can feel it, and all of and some other weird stuff as well. Okay, so it's not necessarily has the specificity of congenital synesthesia. Automaticity as well. Well, it's only automatic perhaps when you're under the influence, and not always then. So it's much more transient. I'll come back to that one. We've got a little time. And then finally, consistency. Well, there hasn't been any consistency test to see if people have the same consistent effect, apart from one experiment by Ramachandran and Brang, where they did it with somebody on melatonin, actually, in fact, was able to demonstrate behavioral consistency using a Stroop task for grapheme color synesthesia, I think. I'm trying to remember. However, okay, so I've now got some case studies which nowhere to be found in the literature. So doing this research, I've come across now 3 people who have self-report having permanent synesthesia, having taken large quantities of psychedelics. One of them, I'll tell you, the first one I met is actually a friend of mine. I didn't realize this. And so he was I think he was a herpetologist, a snake expert, and he had this accident. He had 3 near-death experiences, basically, in the space of a month. The first one was he got bitten by a poisonous animal, had a kind of anaphylactic reaction, needed resuscitating, was in the hospital recovering. But when he was having a near-death experience, he saw these geometric synesthetic experiences, these patterns, which left when the experience went away. He recovered from that. He was then out in the garden in the middle of a storm and was relieving himself against a metal fence when he got struck by lightning, and it jumped the lightning and it stopped his heart, thank you very much, and he had to be resuscitated. And while he's having this near-death experience, sure enough, these geometric kind of colourful patterns come back. Ooh, look at that. 2 weeks later, just about recovered from that, he was then with some friends of his, and I think they had some crystal LSD, which they were trying to dilute rather badly, it turns out, because Well, they estimate they got it wrong by maybe a factor of 100 or so. And they all drank it. He said he was just about to drink it, and he saw the guy next to him had just drank his, and he instantaneously vomited and pooed himself. And he then drank his and did the same, and had like an 8-hour experience somewhere. Came back. They all came back at exactly the same time, apparently. And of course, he got these geometric, synesthetic kind of patterns, and he now has them permanently. The real synesthesia is that they kind of move around, they're dynamic, and they come in and sometimes they start tickling his face, and he'll have to just brush them off like this. So that's one case study. There's another person who's got in contact with me because after a massive dose of 2CB, uncertain quantity again, he hadn't taken many psychedelics before, in fact, but took a big dose of 2CB and then basically had reports having permanent synesthesia since that. The first 2 years he didn't know what was going on, but his is kind of based around personalities, so he'll see people and moods. So there'll be like an aura of colour around people, which he sees permanently now, and they change according to the person's mood or personality. And also there's some of the complex bit to it. Occasionally he sees sound as well, and he has some stuff, but he's kind of dealing with that. And I have another person. So we have 3 people apparently in the literature now, well, not in the literature yet, who have permanently induced synesthesia from taking psychedelics, which would perhaps question, which would be interesting to see, well, how does that fare then to congenital synesthesia? Is it possible to induce permanent synesthesia? I'm not necessarily advise you do that, although the last guy says it's really helping his artwork right now, so that's something. So we'd like to get these kind of questions. We hope to get these guys in the laboratory and test for their, perhaps their consistency. They certainly now have automaticity, which is an advancement on the kind of rather temporary psychedelic-induced synesthesia. And maybe we can look into the specificity of it as well. So maybe there is some more increasing parallel here with congenital synesthesia. I think I'll probably just finish there, and like to thank Erowid and Imperial College and my